All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, any of you listening out there on YouTube. So we published a video yesterday called An Animated History of the Drone, and it was sort of a first for Mashable. We got to team up with our art team and our animation team and make sort of a historical primer about where the drone came from and what it means to the future. So to kind of piggyback on that discussion, we thought we'd continue with some experts in the field. So with us today we have Arthur Holland Michel, who is the co-director of the Center for the Study of the Drone at Bard College in upstate New York. We have Peter W. Singer, strategist at New America Foundation and author of the 2009 bestseller Wired for War, and Lorenzo Franceschi Bicchierai, a reporter at Mashable who specializes in cybersecurity. So, yeah, thank you all for joining. This should be fun. I guess to start, I was hoping we could just kind of go through each of you and have you explain a little bit more about what you do. So Arthur, we can start with you. Can you give us a little bit of your background and how you started, basically from what it sounds like, the first scholarly department on drones?
Sure. I have a pretty complex life background, so I don't want to take up the whole hour on that. But the short story is that I was raised in Peru and came to America via Australia and then Spain. The Center for the Study of the Drone is a project that started as a bit of an experiment at Bard College to see what would happen when we tried to apply an interdisciplinary frame of inquiry and research to the study of the drone. Ultimately, and from the beginning, in the hope of enriching the public discussion about this issue, which back then, which was in 2012, we saw as really starting to rev up. And we saw that there were a lot of policy issues that were going to come to the fore that would really need a sort of robust debate in order to be resolved. To that end, we do a number of things. On the ground at Bard, we teach classes every couple of semesters around these issues. This might be a computer science class where students learn how to program drones, or a history and humanities class where students learn about the history of warfare and aerial bombing and how that sort of provides a context to the current discussion. We also do research, and in this research we try and dig a little deeper into some of the contemporary issues to try and create content that will give the public a better understanding of what's currently going on with drones. To that end, in September of this year, we released our first print publication, which is called the Drone Primer. And basically, the idea with this publication, which is available online, is that you can flip through it and get a sense of the history of drones, something that's covered in the video as well. You can get a sense of what some of the legal issues are, but you can also gain a bit of a sort of cultural understanding of the drone, why it is that we have this sort of obsession with it. That's currently out and free to download, so I encourage you to take a look at it. The last thing I'll say about our project is that drones are very divisive, as we've all seen, and the hope with the center is to really make a non-agenda driven intervention into the debate. Our goal is to study the drone and to provide information about it and to hopefully educate the public. We're not driving for one particular policy or another. We're not pro-drone or anti-drone, whatever that might mean. Our interest is just in having a well-informed public. So I'll shut up now, but that's I think a bit of an overview of what we're trying to do.
Sounds great. I guess, Peter, over to you. I understand you're kind of a jack of all trades as far as cybersecurity is concerned. Can you just give us a brief overview of what kind of led you to research and eventually write Wired for War, and any new developments that you've studied since then?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. So I work as a strategist at New America Foundation, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. We're a place that's nonpartisan, that researches topics that range from kindergarten education to drone warfare, and I do strategy for us overall. My personal research and writing has been on the arc that connects it all has been on changes in modern warfare. So the very first book that I did was a look at the rise of private military contractors, companies that were not selling the goods of war but selling the service side of war. It actually came out before Blackwater existed. Then I did a book on the rise of child soldier and warlord groups. Then, as you mentioned, Wired for War, which looks at another change in the who of warfare. In this case, it was a change to a technology that was both moving the human experience of war. You know, we had people fighting remotely, but also in some ways replacing or at least changing it. And then, as you mentioned more recently, a book that I did called Cybersecurity and Cyber War, What Everyone Needs to Know. It's basically a primer on cybersecurity. How I got into the topic of drones, and we got to be careful. If we were at a U.S. Air Force base, we'd all be walked right out right now for using the word drone. You know, very clear there. No, 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 no. It's not a drone. It's a remotely piloted aircraft, or another group shall say unmanned aerial systems. To me, it's a debate at the end of the day until you can come up with something that rolls off the tongue like drone that's one syllable. You're not going to get people to call it a unmanned aerial system or the like. But so I got into it from this weird experience, and this was back around like 2005. A friend of mine in the Air Force was commanding a unit that was operating drones over Iraq and Afghanistan, and he, though, was living in the U.S., and he had actually been serving in Iraq beforehand, and he described it as actually being more difficult, this new job commanding in the U.S. but fighting remotely, than it had been the deployment when he was physically there. And that struck me as really fascinating. And then about a week or so later, I was at this big conference in D.C., and there were all the leaders from the military and politics, and the conference was about what's changing in war. And again, go back, this is 2005, and the word robot, the word unmanned, the word drone was not said once over 2 days. And this just frustrated me, and many times great books come out of frustration, and so it set me on that journey to essentially take a tour around the world of drones and robots. So meet everything from the scientist who makes them, the military officer who commands them, the insurgent that's being targeted by them, the science fiction author that inspired them. The parallel was a lot like a book like Fast Food Nation. It sort of did a tour around the world of fast food. In this case, it was a tour around the emerging world of drone warfare. And the thing that's changed since then, to answer your other question, we can go into more depth on it, but essentially this topic has not, the technology's got more advanced, it's been used more frequently, but also the topic has taken off. I mean, I remember when I had to explain to a congressman that no, there wasn't a person inside the Predator drone. There wasn't like a little man inside it. To now, it's literally all over the place, whether it's congressional hearings or media or pretty much every movie's got him in there. So the point is, it's a topic that's taken off. But I don't think, as was said earlier, we've really kind of solved or resolved where we are with how we feel about it. Maybe that's the to be in the midst of this transition.
Sure. Thank you. And I guess to quick cut over to you, Lorenzo, do you want to give us a quick background about what you cover?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me as well. So yeah, I'm a reporter at Mashable. My interest is mainly cybersecurity and more in general the intersection of like human rights, civil liberties, and technology. So drones is an interesting topic for me because it sort of like encompasses a little bit of everything. It's a new emerging technology that a lot of people still don't know too much about. It has a lot of implications on civil liberties like privacy, but it also has like an international aspect to, like war law and how, and the whole ethics also using robots in war. And actually, like, funnily enough, I think I started getting into this stuff 2 years ago because of a New Yorker article on an artist in New York that was plastering leaflets saying the drones are watching, and it was sort of like an art project to tell people that the drones were coming. And back then, really very few people knew about drones, especially domestic drones. So that has fascinated me since the beginning. And I think it's, as Peter said, it's kind of crazy to see how mainstream they are now. Like, there are so many stories every week. They're on TV almost every week. But it's still like there's still a lot of misconceptions and issues that we need to figure out as they become more common.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions you can think of off the top of your head?
Well, I think that, well, one thing that I was thinking right now, just right now, was, obviously drones pose certain issues in terms of privacy. I was just thinking about the recent case of an Australian woman that was like sunbathing in her own backyard and was captured by a drone that was snapping a picture of her neighbor's house. And the real estate agency published the photo in a billboard. And she obviously wasn't very happy about that because she was like, half naked. But, that's like, there's a discussion to have about that. But there's also, we can't forget that, at the end of the day, drones are just like little helicopters, and helicopters have been legally able to take pictures from the sky for years. So like, we can't, like, one of the dangers is like rushing legislation, thinking too much about the technology. Like, law needs to be neutral in terms of technology, and it's easy to like overreact to these kind of things. And I think it's important to like understand that this is, even though it's new, like, some of the issues are not that new.
If I could weigh in on that as well, the part of the misconceptions that are out there is just frankly how sloppy we are when we talk about this all. We're sloppy in the word drone itself. People use it to describe everything from completely remotely operated, a human in the loop for everything that it does, to the other end of the spectrum, fully autonomous, which we're really not yet there, but systems where the human is in a managerial role or some kind of programming role. And we talk about them as they're one and the same, or you'll find people try and defend something by saying that it's one way when it's really the other. Another part of the conflation that we're sloppy about is drone warfare, where there's this irony that much of what we talk about is the the lesser percentage of the use of the drones in conflict, which is the CIA high-value targeting, targeted killing, whatever you want to call it, the kind of not-so-covert wars where we're doing airstrikes into non-declared war zones like a Pakistan, like a Yemen, or whatever, where the vast majority of the use is actually by the military in overt combat zones like in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And the difference is everything from the laws they operate under to the people that are behind it, military versus intelligence community, how we report it, et cetera, et cetera. But we smush them together, and we even see that happen with the media when it comes to talking about domestic drones, where there'll be an article about someone using a drone for, I remember when it was an article about using drones in aerial farming, and it was some concern over privacy, is just like Lorenzo laid out, and the picture that was in the news story was of a Predator drone firing a Hellfire missile. Like, these are not the same thing. So we're kind of sloppy in that. And then the last part that I think he hit really well is distinguishing between the technology, which is a tool, and the way you use the technology, which is a practice. Brian Eno was the musician, and he had the saying that, I'm going to mangle it, but essentially, when we don't use something every day, we call it a technology. but then once we use it every day, we stop calling it technology. It's just the things that we use. And drones are in that space between treating it as like this exotic, different thing to know it's just going to be something that's out there, whether it's the way my automobile, the new versions can parallel park themselves, or they've got the warning that someone's coming in your blind spot. We're seeing that kind of robotic technology pop up in a lot of different ways, and drones are part of that robotic revolution. We need to, again, distinguish between there's these tools that are out there versus the practices of like concerns over privacy or the like.
Right. Oh, go ahead, Arthur.
No, I'd say a lot of this sort of points to the fact that, thinking on a sort of historical scale, right now we're in an interesting moment where it's still novel to use a drone. OK Go, the music group, made headlines a couple of weeks ago because they shot their latest music video entirely with a drone. Whereas if they had made that video with a helicopter, say, even though it would have been a lot more difficult, perhaps, and more expensive, certainly, the word helicopter probably wouldn't have figured in the headlines. At the most cynical level, it's a way of sort of generating hits, but people play into that. When we fly, drones around, as we sometimes do, either upstate on campus or sometimes, in New York City, people see this technology and it really sort of resonates with some deep-seated sort of sci-fi sympathy that they have, which, through what we've looked at in terms of sort of the history of literature and film, the public has really been primed to think of the drone as an extremely futuristic technology. And so that spot that we find itself in, which I think will correct itself, in the next, couple of years, makes it kind of difficult to develop policy. It makes it kind of difficult to draw, fixed lines in the sand, because our responses to this technology, it's hard for these responses to be entirely governed by reason and the exercise of common sense, because drones just hit a nerve. So, that's one thing to consider, I guess, when a person looks at a drone, to really think, okay, in what sense is this situation very different because it's a drone being used? I'd sort of push back a little on the idea that there's a total separation between the technology and how the technology is used, because, of course, drones enable certain kinds of activities that just weren't really possible or feasible or realistic before, as in the case of the OK Go video, or in the case of a very precise and specific targeted killing on a known individual. The drone, the military drone used for that strike, will enable that sort of profiling in a certain way because it's able to stay airborne for a very long time with a very high intensity camera, allowing it to loiter and gather a lot of information. But finding some place where that drone is actually making a difference and sort of trying to push away all the sort of implications that have gathered in our head about what a drone means to us sort of emotionally or psychologically, I think is an important thing to try and do if we really want to get to the bottom of the issues.
Right. I understand there was a UN meeting in Geneva this week. You mentioned, Arthur, that discussed lethal autonomous weapons, and part of what came out of that discussion was the idea of swarming.
Mm-hmm.
Admittedly, I'm not very familiar with the idea. Peter, you said that you could walk us through a little bit more about what swarming entails or what it even is.
Sure, but I want to hit one point that Arthur made previously, which is important here.
Okay.
Is again, there's the tool, there's the practice, and tools enable. I 100% agree with him on how they enable the practice. But one of the problems in how we talk about this is we often then put labels back on the tools themselves, as if they're something that they're not. So, for example, ethical drones, or there's this idea that maybe we can make drones ethical or not. That's a lot like describing making your toaster ethical or not, or is your toaster good or bad? It's a tool. Now, the people that program it might be guided by ethics or not guided by ethics, but the machine itself, it's a thing. And that's what we often, in the same point on to take this in the other direction, when we talk about drone strikes and whether they're legal or not, a strike into, say, Yemen, it doesn't turn on the technology itself. It doesn't turn, so the al-Awlaki strike that was in the video, who was the American-born cleric who was an Al-Qaeda member and the like, taken out in a drone strike. Whether taking him out or not was legal, or whether it was ethical or not, was not determined by whether it was a drone or not. It wasn't the drone and the language. If we had used an F-16, a manned F-16, we'd be having much the same debate. The point, just like Arthur said, the fact that it was a drone enabled it, but it doesn't determine the legality or not. The way we often kind of talk about it is, let's just talk about drone strikes, when really what we're talking about is targeted killings. And this hits your question about, we have this debate that's starting to happen on the international law level, and there's different facets of the debate, again, smushing very different things together. Are what we're pissed off about is targeted killings, or no, what we're trying to do is prevent autonomous robotics going about the battlefield, Terminator-like scenario, and the harms that might happen for that? In the same meetings, we talk about both as if they're all, again, we're sloppy about it. But so when we're talking about swarming, the idea is that right now most of the use of unmanned systems has been remotely piloted. Basically, a person sitting somewhere in some command room or base, often in Nevada, but sometimes in Northern Virginia, flying a single plane remotely that may be somewhere else. And it's a very kind of point-and-click style human control on most of the operations, and swarming is the idea that you're moving the relationship from being one person, sort of, so to speak, one machine. It's not really that, but basically this kind of linear relationship, to instead imagine the way a swarm of bees works, or the way a wolf pack works, where rather than it being centralized command and control and distributed firepower, it's the exact opposite. It's decentralized command and control and centralized firepower. You have lots of the robotics all operating on their own. They each individually don't have to be all that smart, but the sum total of them are smart, and then they're communicating amongst themselves to take some kind of action. And so many people, and I'm one of them, think this is one of the kind of futures of war. The challenge for it is, as you decentralize the command and control, as you move the human role from being direct control to maybe managing the swarm, or even just setting the swarm out there on the battlefield, do your own thing, then the law, the ethics, the political questions get really, really difficult. So it may be militarily more effective, but it may be a heck of a lot more difficult to walk through the ethics of it.
Right. I guess jumping back to the U.S., Lorenzo, you reported that, excuse me, on Tuesday the FAA won rights to regulate rules over drone flying. Can you walk us through exactly what that entailed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, basically the news from this week was that a U.S. agency ruled that the FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, has the authority to effectively fine or punish drone pilots in case of, if they're flying the drones recklessly. And this was sort of bad news for drone pilots, because the FAA has a pretty poor record in terms of being open and clear about what the rules are, and the law is very confusing. The regulations are Nobody's really sure that even if the regulations are applicable. But the ruling basically gives the FAA the green light to fine people for flying drones, and obviously, the goal of the goal in this case would be to stop people from using drones in dangerous situations. But it's such a subjective, the red line is so subjective that people are just afraid that this is going to help the FAA just block legal and reasonable uses of drones in the U.S. And as more drones, become available, they're cheaper, they're easier to use. The fear is that this is kind of like choke, basically a rising industry that could have all sorts of like positive and useful applications.
So is there a limit as to how high you can fly?
Well, that's part of it. I think Arthur can also help me out here, but basically, the FAA has always said that the only legal use of drones in the U.S. is until 400 feet in line of sight and not for commercial reasons. And that's basically the real gist of the controversy. Like, why can I fly a drone in public for fun, but I can't fly it for taking a picture of a mansion that then I can put on my website if I'm a real estate agent? Like the use there is the same, the application is the same. I'm using the same technology. Why is that not? There's no inherent danger in one use or the other. The only difference is that I'm getting paid for it. So that's a big issue, and often the critics are pointing out that other countries don't have this kind of regulation, and everything is fine there, or nothing is, there's no real, the controversy is not as big. So I think the FAA deserves some blame because they've been not very good at explaining these issues, and they might have been also guilty of overreacting a little bit sometimes. So I guess that's the main issue in this case.
Yeah, Eric,
maybe I can give a little more context to what's going on with the FAA. The FAA was created in 1958, and back then, as the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the sort of government agency that just issued this decision that we're talking about, as they put it in their decision, in 1958, and I'm quoting, so-called drones were really just the currency of science fiction. When the FAA was given its mandate to make domestic airspace safe, the idea that there would be these unmanned flying vehicles that had the capabilities that we're seeing today was really just the stuff of fancy. So the FAA has this sort of unenviable task of trying to integrate these machines safely into U.S. airspace. I could give a little context as to why it's difficult to integrate drones into domestic airspace. That largely comes down to the fact that there's no one inside the drone, and so drones don't have what is called situational awareness. Whereas a pilot sitting in an airplane can look around, and if there's another airplane sort of hurtling in his direction, he can take evasive maneuvers. But if you're on the ground looking at your drone, or if all you can see is the frame created by a single camera on, say, the nose of the drone, you may not be able to see what's coming at you from, an awkward angle. So part of the difficulty is in trying to prevent these sort of mid-air collisions that, as you can imagine, can be very catastrophic. There are some technologies in the pipeline that are called sense and avoid technologies that basically give drones an almost or totally autonomous ability to sense another vehicle in their presence or another obstacle and make automatic, autonomous, evasive maneuvers. What happened with the with the NTSB decision is that they were really just looking at one small part of a decision that was made by a judge in March of this year, striking down a fine that the FAA had put on this Swiss drone pilot called Raphael Perker, otherwise known as Trappy, for flying a drone over the University of Virginia in what the FAA said was a reckless manner. The premise of the judge's decision was that the FAA can't regulate such a small drone. I mean, this drone could be purchased for $200. It's a phone core model, and the judge said that it was, quote, risible, that the FAA could see itself legitimately regulating everything from flying airplanes to, frisbees, because they sort of, the idea being, where's the line? What the NTSB said in their decision, and really the only point in their decision that sort of matters for our purposes, is that no, a drone is an aircraft, and that the FAA can regulate a drone as an aircraft. If you have a commercial airliner make its final approach into Phoenix Airport and there's a drone in its path, these sort of definitions become kind of beside the point. And what matters is trying to prevent that situation. So another possible reading of the NTSB decision is that it's removing a kind of definition-based barrier to the FAA's ability to go after people who operate drones in a reckless way. There is some amount of logic to that, but there is also a certain amount of concern that the FAA won't exercise this new mandate that it has entirely fairly, and that it won't apply common sense in determining what counts as reckless behavior or not, because that is still something that hasn't been defined in the courts. There's no written definition that we can point to that says, oh, well, this counts as reckless, but this doesn't. There are some hard and fast rules. You can't fly over 400 feet. You can't fly over a densely populated area. You can't fly near an airport. So in those cases, if someone breaks one of those rules, it's clear they've broken the rule. But in the case of the University of Virginia flight, it's sort of up for debate whether people's lives were actually at risk. But if I were to sort of, and now I'm speaking personally and not necessarily in my capacity as director of the Drone Center, it's probably a good idea to remove a sort of technicality-based approach to this debate, because really the ultimate goal here is safety, and so anything that serves to enhancing the safety of the skies is probably a good thing. That being said, there are drones that should be flying right now that aren't flying as a result of that decision, and that is, I think everyone can agree, a bit of a shame.
What type of drones should be flying that aren't flying right now?
I mean, if a person is flying a drone, say, in their backyard, without any desire to go over the 400-foot ceiling, if they're just trying to get a better aerial shot of their house, it's not to say it should be flying. I mean, but it's not hurting anybody, and it certainly isn't illegal according to any of the privacy sort of strictures that exist in this country. It's probably better if I withhold from naming particular ventures that I think are sort of worthwhile and which are not, because that's not really what we're looking at the Drone Center. But I think it can be agreed that there are uses for the drone that don't hurt anybody.
Eric, the challenge of this is it's easy to beat up on the FAA, and I've done it myself, but you have to have some empathy for the position they've been put into, and they've been put into this. Again, it links back to our prior conversation. It's because of the technology, but it's really because of what the technology's enabled. And basically, there's two issues playing out here that are both not technical issues; they're people issues. And one is the politics of this. So if you go back to the history of this, essentially, the FAA, as was just pointed out, has spent not days, not months, not years, but literally decades making the American airspace incredibly safe. And that's their role. That's what they're judged by. And that's now, thoroughly embedded in their culture and DNA. And then a couple years ago, essentially, Congress slips into one of their budgeting bills, hey, oh, by the way, figure out how to open up the airspace to drones. And then right after it slips that in, then this huge debate brews over privacy and the like, and how dare you, FAA, and the very same congressmen who had voted for it then are beating up on them for, are you allowing the airspace to be filled with drones and the like. So there's this one part of this politics thing that's playing out, but basically, their deep concern is safety, and that's what is driving them to make certain kinds of these decisions. The second cultural thing is, as was said before, the very fact that there's not a pilot inside, but it goes to really what the debate is, not just about where can I operate my drone or how can I operate it for profit or not. It's an issue of who. When it came to things in the air, when it came to the people that the FAA dealt with, they were basically either pilots or air traffic controllers or people related to that. They were of a certain profession, and to be defined as that, you couldn't just say, I'm a pilot. You had to go through a kind of training, be licensed and all that. Whereas now, what the real fear is that it's not just, oh, people might be operating drones, it's people who aren't like who we are, that don't have this license, don't have this training. And on one hand, that's the awesome part of drones. That's what's exciting about it, but that's the same thing that gives, the chill factor to the people that have, previously been inside the club. And it's, they're worried about the ways they'll do it. Is they're going to do it unsafe, or will there be a disruption to the industry? That's all the concerns that are playing out right here. And then, of course, like every other human endeavor, money's playing a hand. So like Lorenzo laid out, there's this, on one hand, concern of safety, on the other hand, hold it, are you killing a brewing American drone industry, and all our drone companies are going to go somewhere else? And you hear this often kind of said by the lobbyists, and they'll point to like tests that took place in the UK or in Australia, but again, that same kind of debate has happened around pretty much every law, whether it's environmental standards. The very same thing was said as to why we shouldn't have environmental standards. Oh, American businesses might go elsewhere. I mean, it's just the reality that that's going to be part of the debate. I think we'll work our way through it. And no one's going to be happy at the end of it. No one's going to be able to do exactly what they want, but it does make it clear that, clearly things are going to change, and there's a lot of cool things happening right now, and even more so. So maybe to your question about what's not allowed, maybe we won't get our taco copter anytime soon, which was one of the joking things that was put out there. I think it's more a reason of it's not going to be business. I've I can get my taco at Taco Bell for 99 cents. So, if they can deliver me one, but I have a tough time thinking they're going to deliver it for like 99 cents to me. But the point, leave aside taco copters, I think we will see a lot of the different ways they'll be used, whether it's, aerial photography or other kinds of delivery. It's just going to have to be of things that make both sense from a legal standpoint and, oh, by the way, from an economic standpoint.
Sure. It looks like we're just about out of time. Is there anything any of you want to add before we have to sign off?
I mean, I'd say just, try and get as much of a sense of how drones work. It's very important. There are drones that are autonomous out there, but there are also drones that are really just like large or medium or small remote control airplanes. once you have a sense of the technical limitations, because it all, boils down to what the drone is and is not capable of, then you'll be better informed to look at a rule like, say the FAA regulations that ideally will come out sometime next year and say, oh yeah, given what I know about the drone, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think Arthur makes a good point. Don't let fear and paranoia drive the debate. We've seen a lot of examples of positive uses of drones. Carrying medical supplies, monitoring crops so that agriculture is more effective. There's so many issues, so many uses. Let's not just think that these are bombing machines that are here to spy us.
To me, the exciting thing about this is how it's constantly changing. So, the debates that we're having reflect the state of the technology right now, but as we know, technology's not stopping. And I think we're going to see, real quickly, three big changes. What we, think of as drones look like right now, as I said, little mini, either mini helicopters or planes without a pilot inside, but their size, their shape, their form is going to go into so many different directions, whether it's huge, large scales one that are flying overhead for months or even years, delivering internet, to little tiny creepy insect ones. The second thing that's going to change is their intelligence. As I mentioned, they've tended to be remotely piloted, someone on the ground controlling the operations. They're getting smarter. They're able to do more and more on their own, and that's huge. And that takes us into some of the sci-fi-like dilemmas. But the other part of it is, if they're able to do more and more on their own as they become smarter, it means they're going to be able to do more things for more people. And it's a lot like the computer used to be something that you had to learn a language just to communicate with your computer, BASIC or DOS or whatever. And here we are, using it in a way that was both incredibly sophisticated but quite easy. We just clicked a button, and that's because it's both smarter and easier. And that same thing is going to happen with our drones, with our robotics, and that's going to be exciting, but takes us into all of these scary, spooky, sci-fi-like dilemmas playing out in the real world. So don't just lock in on where we are now, because we'll move past that very soon.
Right. Future is here.
Brave new world.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. I hope to do it again.
Thank you.
To all of you listening from out there.